Hello, my name is David Ades. I'm a poet based in Sydney and the host of a monthly poetry podcast series called Poets Corner in association with WestWords in Parramatta in Sydney's west. WestWords is Western Sydney's literature development organisation. Poets Corner is part of WestWords' public programming that celebrates the richness, diversity and insight that literature offers. Especially in these times, we thank the ongoing support of Create New South Wales, the Cultural Fund of Copyright Australia, City of Parramatta Council, Blacktown City Council, and Campbelltown City Council, as well as the many project partners that have enabled us to continue to provide opportunities to writers and audiences. We hope that this new world will see us sharing and a closeness of spirit. So each month, I invite a poet to read poems and talk about them for an hour or so on a theme of the poet's choice. Our poet today, whom I'll introduce in a moment, is Anthony Lawrence, who will be reading and talking on the theme of the poetic impulse. But before I start, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. I'm recording this from Beecroft in Sydney. Anthony is recording from Moreton Bay in southern Queensland. I'd like to pay my respects to and acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging of the Wallamita people, the traditional custodians of the land in Beecroft, and of the Quandamooka people, the traditional custodians of the land in Moreton Bay. And to acknowledge also that they are the sovereign owners of their land, which has never been ceded or given up. Anthony Lawrence has published 17 books of poems and a novel. His most recent collection is Ken, Life Before Man 2021. His books and individual poems have won many awards, including the Prime Minister's Literary Award for Poetry, the Kenneth Slessor Award, the Judith Wright Calanthe Award, the Philip Hodgins Memorial Medal and the Blake Poetry Prize. A new collection of prose poems, The Side the Weather Does Not Love, is to be published in 2021. Anthony teaches creative writing and writing poetry at Griffith University and lives on Moreton Bay, Queensland. Hi, Anthony, and welcome to Poets Corner.
Oh, thank you very much, David. It's great to be here. Thanks for the intro.
That's all right. Now you've chosen the poetic impulse as your theme. I'm going to ask the obvious first question. What do you mean by the term the poetic impulse?
Well, sometimes it is a poetic insult. It's the poetic impulse is something that I'm deeply interested in. Mainly because I've noticed over the years that that it manifests itself in really interesting ways, and I've often wanted to try to articulate it, to explore it. It's that moment which is often quite a magical but strange alignment between the emotional and the physical, where an overwhelming sense of need befalls me, I guess, is not too heavy a term, and there's little I can do to resist it, and I need to start writing. I've noticed over the years that it takes on quite a similar, it releases a similar spark in that it's most often after I've been reading poetry. Of course, you know, a single word or a phrase can just ignite us and drive us to the desk. But it's happened while I've been out on the continental shelf with no pen and paper. So I've had to use the end of a screwdriver and a zinc plate that I found on the boat from an old bashed up radio to record this stanza. Otherwise, it was just not going to get done. And the thing is too, unless we attend to this very quickly, I learned the hard way, and I guess all poets have at some stage, that if we think that it's okay to consign that original blueprint to memory until we get a chance to write it down, it'll be okay. Occasionally, it is. Mostly what happens is the distorted version of the original live wire, and I don't take chances with that. I haven't done so. It was very difficult writing my Triumph around the place because on a long country ride, if that happened, I'd have to stop the bike, get off, take off the gloves and the helmet, go into the saddlebag, get a pad and pen. Whereas if I'm driving, I can tend to steer with my knees and scribble something, yeah. I'm currently writing a little paper, a little essay, in fact, on driving and the poetic impulse and writing poetry. The two have long had a very cozy, if sometimes perilous, relationship. Not so much anymore that I've stopped drinking and don't roll cigarettes anymore, because I don't tend to steer with my knees now while I'm having a stubby and a champion ruby. Now it's a matter of trusting in my handwriting while I steer and look at the road on sheets of cardboard that I cut for that purpose, that I have on my lap when I'm driving. So I just reach for a sheet of cardboard and my trusty black felt pen, and away I go. But the poetic impulse is really my kind of useless attempt to track down the ineffable. I think as poets, we're in full employ of the unachievable. It's why there are no perfect poems. It's why there are very, very good poems, wonderful poems. But there's no point in trying to track down anything beyond what we can do with the best of our abilities. Most of the poems that we write come close, I think, to achieving the sum of their true potential. Some of them hit the mark, but I'm very happy if I'm able to write a poem that despite its failings, its small glitches and potholes, I can let it go, because I don't really want to overwork things. I have done, but we need to know when to walk away. But from the very outset, I don't look at a sheet of empty paper and wonder about how it could be improved. There's no time for that. I just dive in. And of interest to me is the fact that I write all my poems line by line. I have never written a poem out in one flurry, in a sense of just getting it all down, because I don't know what it all is, and I don't have that kind of brain. Maybe because until quite recently, I had an undiagnosed adult ADHD condition, which is the depletion of dopamine. So that kind of miswiring, neurological miswiring, is really of great interest to me, because I do believe, in fact, that's one of the reasons why, with no family history of poetry, that I think this is the reason, the driving force behind why I became a poet. I think we don't have time to go anywhere near exploring that, but I'm really intending to do that in a paper on the poetic impulse. In my case, adult ADHD. I've lived with it all my life. It's not something you suddenly develop as a teenager, but I'm on a course of Ritalin, and I have to say it's a complete life changer. Unbelievable. And I cursed the psychiatrist who diagnosed it. He did say that this is, I was, classic. And but he said, when I asked him, what are the chances of me not being able to write poetry once I start Ritalin? He said, "Oh, you probably won't be creative." But in fact, it's the exact opposite. It's sharpened my resolve and my attention to what's important. So, I don't lose things anymore, and I'm able to make deadlines. And, well, apart from my false teeth this morning, they're around somewhere. But, it's a big deal. And I look back on that young man that used to lose everything and get always in the bottom class at school, despite being really bright. Relationship issues. It's just been really telling. And the reason I looked into it so deeply was because I was watching a video quite by accident, and this professor in America was talking about adult ADHD, and I felt myself leaning in closer and closer as he was talking. And by the end of this hour, I was really near close to tears, because I recognized myself all my life. I ticked every single box. And anyway, it's been an interesting ride.
So, Anthony, the poetic impulse in your sort of understanding of it is the compulsion to write.
The compulsion to write, in particular. I mean, there's a poetic impulse behind lots of things. You know, choosing the right record to put on a Sunday afternoon is part of that as well. But which will probably be Melanie's version of Ruby Tuesday. Well, it was when I was hungover. But yeah, it's certainly the need to create. And that first line that I write, I have no idea. Often, most of the time, what it means. I never have a theme. I never have an overarching idea, and that's because that was reinforced when I read the wonderful advice by Richard Hugo, the wonderful, much loved, deeply influential poet, who said that the thing to remember most is that we need to place our idea of subject matter into the service of our language, not the other way around. Because the moment that we force our language to adhere to our idea of subject matter, then that's what we do. We will fall into a pattern of one-dimensionality and writing to a subject, rather than allowing the wonderful gift of our imaginations to be peripheral and associative, and to explore the unknown, to arrive at a subject that really, from the outset, we didn't really understand until we started to write. And that's a really big thing for me. And I love that I'm able to trust in my intuition and imagination, and enter a poem with really having no idea about where I'm going. And that pretty much applies to everything I write. I work on one line and then I'll finish it, and then what now? You know, and then it will feed into another, and then I've got the words, and then I go, and then that wonderful marriage of craft and technique kicks in, where line breaks are attended to, and I notice things like internal rhymes ringing off each other, even 5 or 6 lines away, which I didn't understand why a poem sounded the way it did until I isolated those things. So, and stanzas and negative space and that beautiful pause for the eyes, and why some stanzas announce themselves and in fact demand attention at the end when everything else has been tried. Block form, tercets, and then suddenly the poem, no, it's quatrains, buddy. See you later. You know.
All right. Well, I'm going to ask you. You asked me to choose a whole bunch of poems from a whole bunch of poems that you sent, and I chose the ones that worked for me on the day. I'd really like you to kick off your reading with Daylight Star, if you would, please.
Daylight Star. The only daylight star I've seen, apart from one that burns the retina long after exposure, turned out to be the last international flight before borders closed, like theatre doors. I tried to imagine your face in a window on that 747 bound for London, although you might have been at home, moving from room to room and putting things into boxes. I'll never know. Communication and precise location have been abandoned, as when a transponder is turned off unexpectedly. I am prone to confuse the sound of packing tape being torn from its roll with a fighter jet passing over a break wall where we had been scanning the sky for Sirius, and Capella with binoculars. I like to bring things closer than how they first appear. Your mouth and eyes to be unapologetically sentimental about it. Also the regulated bloom and fade of an artery in your neck that I love to time with nerves in the tip of my tongue. An airliner gleams and vanishes. A planet is mistaken for a star.
Yeah, in the context of your theme of the poetic impulse, I really love the lines, I like to bring things closer than how they first appear. Is there a poetic mission beneath the poetic impulse to try and bring things into sharp clarity?
Yeah, there is, David. And there is. And that, of course, has a lot to do with the use of literal or figurative language. And, I think some of the poems from the early poems, William Carlos Williams in Paterson, contain literal imagery where, and we often take this for granted when we're reading poems, that not everything has to be metaphorical or offer us alternatives, which of course is what similes do, offer us a chance to compare and contrast. His poems often detail exactitude, and in that clean line writing, there are also just the most beautiful images. So yeah, it's all about the combination of those things, and that's how I try to track things down.
Is it about trying to understand the world?
No, not really. I gave up on that a long time ago. You know,
It's too hard.
But seriously, I'm as troubled and as wondrous as anybody about being alive on this planet. And poetry for me is, as any creative person knows, whether you're a painter or an actor or whatever you do, whatever you are chosen to do, is a way of making sense of the world and my life in it, and it's of comfort to me and a help.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I like your use of the word wondrous there, because I've often thought of the poetic eye, and I feel that everyone has it. It's every time anyone senses wonder, they're looking at the world with a poetic eye, in my view. And I think probably everyone's a closet poet, whether they've written poetry or not.
I think that's right.
But that's different from the poetic impulse, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, because that's what happens. That's what happens, when I wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning or have an afternoon nap, whatever, or which Don Patterson says is very good for the heart, but I believe him, and that's a good thing. So yeah, the poetic impulse is really, I like to think of that wonderful Zen saying, leap and a net will appear. And so that's how it is, really. We can't afford to second guess ourselves when we feel the need to create, when that comes upon us, because if we do, then you end up marking time rather than taking a risk with, in our case, language, and diving in and not at the initial stage, but later on, that wonderful orchestration of vowel and consonant that we arrange while we're drafting. And I love that. That's the real writing, and that I love spending a week or a full day or a month on a poem, whatever it takes, to finally get to the point where I just have to walk away.
All right, let's dive into another one.
Okay. Well, I'll read Conjuring because this is for my late uncle, Lawrence. My dad's elder brother, who was a spook in New Guinea during the war. Very interesting man. Came back with shell shock. Wasn't called PTSD then. It was shell shock, and there have been so many different names for it, railway spine and all sorts of terrible things. But Laurie was a professor of geology at the University of New South Wales, a remarkable guy. And this poem is for him. It's called Conjuring, for James Lawrence. Killing time was a saying my uncle took literally. Returning from war, he refused to wear a watch and banned clocks from the house. The exception to this outlawing of visible time took the form of an intricate song machine, a box within a box that opened to reveal, after winding, an exotic singing bird that emerged through spring-loaded doors on a golden plinth with a miniature clock face set into it. The cogwheels and pins were so numerous and tiny when doing repairs, his tools might have been like those a cardiothoracic surgeon employs when reconnecting nerves. Reclusive, he loved all-night vigils in his study, in surgical light, staring through his loupe into alexandrite, blue agate, and once in the red line fractures of a rhodolite garnet, he saw the feathers of the long-eared owl that called each night before setting out to trace the ultraviolet lines of vole and mouse urine in the grass. Listening, he remembered the tight bindings on shrouds at sea burials they had piped away, sailing home from war. He turned off the lamp and opened a drawer. He wound the box and released the bird. When the whirring gears and scaled down song had died away, he placed a finger to the inside of a wrist, timing his pulse as he'd done when the whistling rain of mortars had begun.
Yeah, this poem to me is in itself a kind of conjuring.
Yeah, all those things he based. I had long, amazing conversations with him. He was a nuisance too, because I was standing in his study one night where he kept his drawers full of all these beautiful minerals and rocks and bits of meteorite that he'd found, and he gave me this rock to hold, and I was holding it, and he started laughing, and I said, "What's so funny?" He said, "You're being X-rayed because you're holding raw uranium." He's holding some yellow cake there, buddy. So I gave it back to him, and
well, there's a tenderness in this poem, a tender imagining, and it takes me into where poetry can go, because every person is a person really unknown. You really never can get inside somebody's head.
That's right.
All you can do is imagine a little bit of it, which is what you've done here and brought him to life. It's really an entry into the mystery of a person, and at the same time, the poem is entering into the mystery of the poem.
That's a really amazing thing to say, David. You're absolutely on the money, and that's something really important to think about writing poetry, is that we can't know. You write a love poem for someone. That's writing a poem about a part of that person or parts of the person that you know, that it's impossible to know someone completely. And it really, this leads me into an argument that I've had with people over the years about it's poetry, so I'm allowed to make things up. What about if I invent people that don't exist, but people then say to me, hang on a minute, you know, you don't have an elder sister, or you don't have this in your life. Why did you do that when you knew it wasn't true? And I say, well, the bottom line is that I draw the line, in fact, on not exposing people's inner secrets, so I don't set out to hurt people. But if I invent a person in a poem, whether it's a dramatic monologue or whatever it is, where I can wear a mask while telling this poem, narrative, whatever, then I think that's okay. I'm not writing memoir. I'm a poet. And whether I'm reinventing someone that I know or inventing someone from the outset, from the ground up, it's just all part of that wonderful process.
Well, you can approach the truth from an imagination, can't you?
Yeah, that's right. And I don't want to have to put a footnote into every book or every poem saying, by the way, this person isn't true, I made it up. You know, it's up to the reader to define the terms of those things.
Well, it comes back to that old argument about whether the narrator of a poem is really the poet.
Yeah, that's right. Just because you use I doesn't mean that it's you.
Quite. All right. Got another poem?
Yeah. Look, yeah, I'll read Outlaw Boxcar, because this takes me back to a time when this is classic ADHD stuff. I used to turn up to my dad's work in a ratty old suit with bare feet, and this dad was a personnel manager, and he was so embarrassed that his son would turn up looking like that. But for me, I was being equally defiant and just myself, but pretty disrespectful. It's called Outlaw Boxcar. If I had a white horse with a mane you imagine a horse should have when riding it into the sheen of what's left of the moon after a storm had taken to it with electric carving knives and a boombox, I would ride into my father's building and say, "Good boy, Outlaw Boxcar," as that's the kind of name you give a horse when you're trying to make amends for being a punk instead of a responsible son. And so you take the fire stairs 5 at a time, the sound of Boxcar's iron shoes on the cement like a tap dancing competition in a tiled bathroom. And when you dismount outside your father's office and knock like a gentleman and say, "Dad, it's me. I'm here to be the son you never had but wanted." The corridor going on into dark wood and shadow, and then your father is there, filling the frame of the door with a smile and offering Boxcar a palmful of coffee sugar crystals, and rubs the star on his nose and looks at me like a father who understands his son has come, not home, but into the world of men. "You are welcome here any time," he says. And then, as if an afterthought had set off a roadside device in his ear, "And next time, take the lift. It's big enough for a clopper with a flame for a mane and a son with a horse-sized heart."
So I have to ask you, Anthony, how did you come up with the name Outlaw Boxcar?
No idea. Poetic impulse.
I was expecting a saloon to appear in this poem somehow.
Well, I know, the swinging doors inside Union Carbide. In Zetland, and I never got into an argument with Dad about Union Carbide because he loved his work, and I didn't think it was worth my hide to kind of. I did mention it, but I didn't go on because we had a pretty volatile relationship, and he had a good left hook and was a he played rugby union for New South Wales Country. He was a tough dude, but yeah. So I don't know. That name just appeared out of the ether, really. I love the name. Outlaw Boxcar.
It's a great name, and
you're
right into sort of country and western mode, and
that's right. Riding the carriages into Oklahoma.
This poem is kind of like a wish, in a way.
Yeah. My dad passed away 20 years ago, and some things are never too late.
No, I mean, you never stop having the conversation with him, even if he's not.
No, you don't. No, absolutely not. And I've been asked, why do you write so many poems, either dedicated to your father or about your father? And I go, because so much was left unresolved.
Well, you sort of mentioned before that you write a line by line.
Yeah. That's actually the exception. That poem that came quite quickly.
But you still don't necessarily know where it's going to take you until you get there.
Oh no, not at all. I love that. You must love that too, don't you?
I do love that.
Where there's no signposts. You don't have a compass. You don't have a map with a legend while you're writing poetry. You're stepping in there with the faith that something's going to happen, and that's its miracle.
Yeah, and it's never the poem you think you're going to write.
No, that's exactly right.
How do you think the poetic impulse is different from the narrative impulse? Because many of these poems are also narratives.
Yeah, I like to think of them as narrative poems with a rich lyrical vein inside them to help move things along. I don't think there is a difference. I'm sure that Tim Winton, a novelist that I admire very much, would have some very interesting things to say about. He's also, I mean, he writes some astounding images that'd be at home in any book of poetry. You know, I'd like to ask him about the poetic impulse or the narrative impulse. I imagine that there'd be similar crossovers. When I was writing my first and probably only novel, In the Half-Light, I remember sitting down and really the same things happening. The novel began as a series of prose poems that morphed into a longer narrative. And but you know, the big difference is that you've got to be really in there for the long haul. I would go into my study up on the mountain, on the slopes of Mount Wellington in Hobart when I was writing it, and be in there all day, and you know, and emerge at the end of the day completely exhausted from living with imaginary people all day and listening to what they had to say and moving them around. And it's a really strange enterprise, writing a novel, because you know, really is like watching a sepia tone slow motion movie and just writing down what you see and hear. And for me, that was exactly the same kind of impulse.
Okay, another poem?
Sure. Live wires. I've always been really fascinated by the nasties in Australian water and inland, and certainly box jellyfish are up there, and particularly the irukandji. Those tiny little things that are often smaller than your thumbnail, with trailing wires that can kill you, but not just that, install in you apparently an overwhelming sense of doom as you go down, as your internal organs start to shut. Extraordinary creatures. So live wires, and this is really comes from being stung by Portuguese man of war, also known as blue bottles, which are pretty tame, really, when you're in the scheme of things. Leaving a delayed reaction to pain side stroke out back of the breakers, you emerge in the neon strip lighting of your skin. And when you lie in the sand, begging her to urinate on the welts and lesions across your chest and shoulders, like straps on a rawhide bandolier, she does, suggesting you don't make the request outside of emergency hours. And you love her even more when she says, Portuguese man of war and stingers. And as the urine dries and the pain gives way to an irritating surface glow, like sunburn, you find a pair of oyster catchers using red beak spikes like pointers at the broken whiteboard on a cliff. So you follow their instructions, combing the beach for shells, stones, and twists of driftwood, feeling again the whip and afterburn that follows swimming into live trailing wires. Then you settle back to watch light flare and die, with its reminder that you're now on the critical side of middle age. And when you leave, reading directions in the prints of shorebirds and talking about medicinal intimacy, ghost crabs rise like the mantles of lanterns to repair the sand mandalas beside their holes.
I like how in this poem, readers are given glimpses of things that are not actually fully articulated. So we're given a glimpse of a very helpful woman who has a certain...
It does work, yeah.
Who has a certain degree of humor as she goes about helping the person. And we're given a glimpse of the person being in a particular point in life.
It wasn't a heavily populated beach either, I might hasten to add.
Just as well. How much of the poetic impulse is to leave things unstated?
Oh, what a great question. I think it's a huge part of it. And I think it's a huge part of it because if I don't know, what's going to be happening next. You know, when they talk about, I think Charles Simich's book, who's a really fine, as you know, surrealist in the tradition of Popa and other former Yugoslavian poets. That wonderful kind of Serbian tradition, for example, of magic realism in poetry. A critic said about The World Doesn't End that you never know what's awaiting you inside a Simic poem as you're reading, a bludgeon or a kiss. And so that's really what it's like while I'm writing. I'm anticipating something that I have no idea what it might be, but the anticipation is heightened. And so while I'm trying to work things through, not knowing where I'm going, the unknown is always there. And if it announces itself as an important part of a poem where things need to be left unsaid, unchecked, then that's exactly what happens. And so the poem will remain, or elements of the poem will definitely remain unresolved. And I think that's a really good thing. I think a lot of younger poets or beginning poets tend to over-explain things because they feel that they owe it to a reader or themselves perhaps to fill in the gaps, to paint by numbers, to really leave no turn unstoned.
Yeah, I could ask you more and more about this, but I'm conscious of time, so I'll get you to another poem.
Okay. I think Telling the Wasps is a good poem to read here. There's a very ancient tradition of going out to tell the bees about a death. But I wanted to invert that and to tell the wasps. Telling the Wasps. A variation on the tradition of going out to tell the bees of a death is to locate wall-mounted estates of paper hexagons whose residents have fighter-pilot eyes, trailing legs, and seem less troubled by details of dying than having someone enter the stinging zone, where injections of noradrenaline are given in quick succession. And passing through, mention your delight in finding shades of blue, a wall of ice, a vein, a plan to seduce yourself in a bed of cornflowers. Then say words wasps like to hear, afterlife and forgiveness, repeated as a mantra into waves of humming air. And reveal your secret life, including the belief that love, when it ends, is another kind of death. And as the weight of your grief begins to lift, follow the consoling flight of the acoustic moth into meadowlands, the overhanging limbs of river trees, the bells of wildflowers, and cottage gardens as bees exchange plans for survival in times of disease or fire.
This poem is not about wasps at all, is it?
No, not at all. They just happen to be the vehicle that I chose to carry the undercurrent of the poem along.
Yes, and when you're saying reveal your secret life,
yeah,
this is really the poetic impulse, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It's amazing, you know, brilliant. That's exactly what it is. The whole poem is about the poetic impulse, really, without having to kind of over-explain
it. Yeah. Just sort of going through some of these poems and the other ones that you sent me, it seems to me that wherever you go in a poem and whatever their framework, your poems are always returning back to the human condition. And you've kind of answered this question. The question I was gonna say was, but in a way where whatever insights may be gleaned along the way, nothing is ever resolved. And you've actually answered that. You said that's
right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not intentional. I don't mean to you know, to leave the gate open all the time. But there's no point in closing it either. You know, things are unresolved.
I think the older we get, the less we know.
The older we get, the less we know. And in fact, if Charles Wright, for example, one of my favorite poets, if it's true, and I think this is right, that his entire writing, his whole writing life has been one extended elegy, that he's using the elegy to define the natural world, his relationships, his time in Italy, whatever it is. I think this is the natural condition of the poet to be elegiac and not to eulogize, but I think it's really interesting that I see a lot of my poems as elegies, just to being alive.
Mm.
You know, you don't have to write elegically about you know, death or the afterlife. There's enough of that here, you know, and just not knowing what's going on from day to day, and really being aware of the impossibility to come to terms with the ineffable. And that, for me, is exciting and daunting all in one go, you know. It's the natural vehicle for the elegy poetry.
Mm. All right, another poem, please.
A wild boar walks into a hearse. Okay. And says nothing, because the forklift tines of its tusks are jammed in the chrome trim of the door. The driver gets out and kneels beside the swine with hair like broom straw and offers a hand. Releasing a razorback must surely rate high among activities likely to cause disfigurement or death, yet a flurry of funerary cloth and feet, and the boar is in the gutter, eyes like onyx replacements during mortuary repairs. Traffic has jammed the road where a Walt Disney doppelganger and clown are going toe to wedding ring under a stop sign. But we have no need to concern ourselves with peripheral details. The hearse pulls away like soiled bandage from the curb, and the boar goes to wherever wild things go, after close encounters with caretakers of the dead.
Well, it's interesting that you were talking about Charles Simic and surrealism, because this is about as surreal as it gets.
Yeah, I have no idea what this poem's about. Maybe someone else could tell me. But I love that. I have no idea. You know, I'm very fond of the poem, and as I tell my students, you know, you don't have to have, your poems don't always have to make sense. If you're true to your language and your imagination, and you take risks with language and syntax, and you work hard on them, and at the end you really don't have any idea about what you've done, that's fine. Let the reader work it out, you know.
Well, I mean, the reader has that position of bringing their own perspective to something.
Yeah.
So it's always going to be a different reading of whatever was intended anyway.
That's right.
Now, in this poem, you address the reader, but we have no need to concern ourselves with peripheral details.
Yeah.
Just after having introduced some peripheral details, as a reader, I love being addressed by writers. It makes me complicit in whatever's going on.
I like it too. Yeah, except when I'm reading Murray Bale, because he uses damn parentheses. You know, I think they should be banned. They should be stricken from the language in creative writing. As soon as you enclose something in brackets, it draws undue attention to itself and takes you out of the narrative. I wish you wouldn't do it. There's no need for it.
Did you have a particular intent in doing that here? That sort of
no, I didn't know what I was doing, apart from the fact that to concern ourselves, meaning I don't want to go back and have to explain why these guys were fighting under a stop sign. Let's just accept the fact that they are and get on with it, you know.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I think you've got two more poems for us.
Okay, lovely. Well, let's go back to horses. This one's called Night Horse. This is this is based on an experience I had as a young man working on Yanko Station, which in fact Philip Hodgins and I used to talk about excitedly, because we both had worked on this place and also had fished for yellowbelly and redfin in Yanko Creek and trapped fish and caught Murray cod and all sorts of amazing things in the rivers. So the night horse is a job that I used to do as a jackaroo, where I worked on this farm for a couple of years, and it's a sheep station. It was 300,000 acres, since subdivided and sold off into much smaller lots in the Riverina outside Jerilderie. But the job was at 4 o'clock in the morning to go out, saddle up the night horse that was in its stall, and go out and get in the working horses for the day from a 100-acre horse paddock. And the bay mare would be wearing a cowbell, so you'd listen in the black and follow the sound, and you'd find them most often at the far end of the, because they knew the far end of the paddock, down in a waddy, in a gully, and get in behind them and have all the gates open and bring them back into the horse yard for the day's work. Everything was mustering back then. No ag bikes, no choppers. Night horse. I teased the night horse from her stall with an apple that reveals on its skin wind-fallen versions of grass and sky, where it was found at the hour the fox returns, to a shade of red commonly seen in the high velocity wound it takes in its stride, then to ground. I call the night horse by her name. She moves and makes a hollow sound of living weight against the wood. The grain worn smooth from years of horses, called from sleep before the sun's own work begins. I shake a blanket, then throw it like the fabric used in magic tricks to make things appear to vanish. Yet here, in dark, intensified at the sides of a flashlight beam, stirrup irons and shadows are still in thrall to the ghosts of cattlemen. The night horse leads me into dawn, which begins as a line that breaks and mends on both sides of a fence. The wire strands lit up as if from within. From 16 hands high, the view is as good as it gets.
I have to ask you, Anthony, how many years after this occurred did you write the poem?
Oh, about 25.
Isn't it interesting how these things stay with us?
Yeah, I couldn't have written that poem. I was too young, and also the poems I was writing back then were chronically sentimental, and Rod McEwen copies, and Richard Brautigan copies, and Leonard Cohen copies, and terrible things. But you got to start somewhere. So this poem had to wait.
Yeah. And to me, it's like a classic poetic impulse paying homage to a moment.
Yeah, it really is, David. I can't remember. In fact, I wrote it. The first poem I ever published was called Night Horse in New Poetry in 1975. Robert Adamson published it in New Poetry after I sent it to him. And I was thinking about that. In fact, I found that issue where I share I'm opposite Gig Ryan's. It was amazing, back in the day, to be such a young bloke, first published poem with a poet whose work I really like. So I was thinking about that, and then all those memories came back, and then that was the impulse for writing Night Horse. Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Maybe I'll read finish up with rowing out to check the traps. It's a poem for our time, really. Keeping time with the catch and release of the current, I am rowing out to check the traps, loving the knock and settle of wood in the oarlocks, a gannet riding over on another kind of current. And as the hood on my anorak rustles and the oars rise and fall, I say words inherited from my father, who knew the names of fish, cloud patterns, seabirds, and combinations of tablets he would swallow without fear of contraindication, such as leaning forward as though he were deep in prayer instead of pain, or knowing philosophy is useless in the full immersion of a loss of intimacy. And now that time alone has become first and second nature, in his absence, with the borders of the world locked tight as bivalves, solitude is a commentary on plankton, milt, apex predators, and outtakes from journals solo sailors scribbled into. Also my love of the cold startle of wave spray. I ship the oars and drift from the green blur of land and thoughts of contagion, the current drawing me away, the ocean going on. And soon I am too far from shore to turn about and take up the oars, yet not beyond the limits of what it means to be lost at sea, the traps forgotten, the ones I cobbled from tomato stakes painted with creosote and covered with wire, abandoned on a reef as I circumnavigate myself as much as the outline of the shore, out of touch, but not outcast in the time I have and the time I have left.
Yeah, I was mesmerized by this poem, Anthony, I've got to say. I could feel a kind of rhythm in it, the catch and release of the current, the oars rise and fall, the meandering drift from the green blur of land, solitude, circumnavigation, where time alone has become first and second nature, the time I have and the time I have left. And you could read it as parable or as allegory or as any number of different things, couldn't you?
Yeah. Elegy.
Elegy. And what are the traps you're really checking?
The traps don't exist. The traps are metaphorical.
That's exactly right.
You're picking up on everything today, aren't you? You're
right.
Amazing. Goodness gracious. The traps are pitfalls of my own, of things that I really either have control over or don't have control over, but ignore regardless. And move around them all the time, you know.
And we all have them.
We do. This could be subtitled a short essay on adult ADHD. You know?
Well, you don't have to have ADHD to have these kind of issues going on in your life, I don't think.
Oh yeah. Look, just while I'm here, can I just mention a few new poets that I've discovered that I might like to pass on to people, because you know, as you are, you know, an avid reader of anything that I can find that has poetry in it. I've just made a list up here on the whiteboard. There's a wonderful a poet who's just won the International Poetry Pamphlet Competition in the UK, and his name is Dean Brown, Bron, Browne, as in Jackson Brown. He's remarkable. I can't wait to see this pamphlet, but he's a real find, a young guy from Northern Ireland. Northern Irish, can you imagine? I mean, imagine that whole group that Muldoon came out of, with, you know, Muldoon and Heaney, of course. Michael Donaghy, that whole group. Claire Pollard has been around for a while, but she's a knockout British poet, published with Blood Axe. Terence Hayes.
Yeah, I love Terence Hayes.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Wind in a Box, what a knockout book. Of course, Michael Donaghy, if no one knows about Michael Donaghy, then you need to break a land speed record and get to wherever you can to grab that book. It's his collected poems called Smith, edited by Don Patterson, Scottish poet. Donaghy, I think, he left a massive hole in contemporary poetry when he died young. He died at 50 of a cerebral hemorrhage, and published only 3 books in his lifetime. but every one of them is just filled with masterpieces of controlled wildness and attention to form and detail that is just breathtaking. Wow. Liz Berry, of course, and my old favourites, James Wright, Charles Wright, Muldoon, Cannell, Sharon Olds, Basil Bunting, Geoffrey Hill, Sheets and Kelly. Yeah, so many. I mean, as you know, it's a long list, isn't it?
It's endless.
It's a long list, yeah. King David,
I think we should mention also for our viewers that we're going to try something new, and we're going to post copies of your poems when we do record the podcast. So look out for that.
That would be great.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for sharing poems and insights on the theme of the poetic impulse. It's been a great...
thanks, David. This has been a really wonderful chance to talk about something that I'm both in awe of and really have no answers for, but love to discuss. So thank you for your really insightful, generous questions, and I look forward to having it out there in the world.
When this video is posted, it will include information on Anthony's books. You've got to get it to us.
Yeah.
So look out for that. Please check in again at the end of July when Poets Corner will be back with featuring Michelle Seminara on the theme of suburban noir. Look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.